Hey collectors, this is Leighton from Just Collect. Welcome to another video about a collection that we've bought recently. I want to tell you all about the process and what we bought. A number of months ago, the annual Strongsville, Ohio vintage card show took place. And a friend of mine asked me if I was going out because he had a friend, an older gentleman, that was living just outside of Strongsville and had a variety of vintage cards and singles and autographs, which I'll be honest was a little bit tough to tear me away from because it's such a good show. But the gentleman told me he had some vintage sets and some other goodies that I was interested in checking out. So upon arriving in his home, we went into his man cave basement and I was thoroughly impressed. The walls were covered with autographed memorabilia from Cleveland Browns players to Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. He had a run of vintage sets from the 1950s and 1960s. And so at that point, I wasn't really told that he was willing to sell the sets. He kind of wanted just to show me what he had. And of course, even though I'm excited, it's like kind of tying one hand behind my back. You know, like, is this show and tell? Am I ever going to be able to buy this material? So anyway, I still went along for the ride. And once I got into the vintage sets, I realized that they weren't super duper high grade, but they also weren't low grade either. And because each of the sets had the key cards and rookies graded and authenticated, I had a pretty good idea of what was there. So fast forward, I go through the sets, I take some notes, and I asked this gentleman, like, what's the scoop? You know, do you want to do business today? And he was apprehensive. He didn't want to do business, but I took some notes, kind of gave me a tour of the man cave, went back to the convention. So my friend reached back out to me shortly after the convention, let's just say a few weeks, maybe a month had transpired. And all of a sudden, he had told me that his friend was looking to potentially move forward now. He's like, when are you coming back out? Of course, you know, I have to make arrangements and such. Once again, I go through the process of taking the graded cards, he sent me some images, and I value them, and I make him an offer, and we now have an understanding. We reached a deal. It wasn't easy, but we reached a deal principally on the vintage sets and most of his vintage graded cards. And so I figured that if I can do a deal with this gentleman and I could buy either some or all of his collection, maybe there's a chance he's going to tell other of his friends and other of his constituents and peers in that Strongsville and Cleveland area. I am going to be traveling out there, and to be clear, I am flying out, and that's right, I'm driving back a one-way rental from Cleveland. I'm flying into Cleveland. I'm gonna do a couple deals out there, but the Strongsville, Ohio collection was the main reason I went out there. And then when I'm done, after a couple days, I'm gonna drive the material back. And the reason I like that in particular is because I didn't have to ship it. That cost real money. Fast forward, get to his basement, start right with the sets, because that's a big chunk of money. And believe it or not, after going through probably a dozen or 15 vintage sets, I verified the graded. The only card I think that was missing was a 1969 Topps Hank Aaron. I didn't even mention it because it wasn't worth it. And if that's the only problem of the day, we are in excellent shape. And I'm thinking we are just smooth sailing. But you can tell, that's right, there might be an issue on the horizon. Most of the cards, like I said, fell between that $50 and maybe $500 range. There was a few outliers, including, I think the most expensive card was about $15,000 or $20,000. And so I get to that card and I look at the front. Now, it's not the cleanest card, but not a big deal. I figured not every high-end or not every PSA 8 is created equal. So I turn it over and I'm like, what is that? He's over there talking to my friend, by the way. So I'm just by myself. I might even have headphones in at this time. And I'm like, you know, I turn the case over. What is this? And I'm kind of like shaking it for a second. It's not really moving. I'm like, oh dear. And so what happened was a piece of the plastic from wherever on the holder got dislodged, and it was on the back of the card. It literally lie flush against this $20,000 card. I had to bring it his attention because the card really should be re-encapsulated without that floating debris in there. Partly because it's just loose, and then partly because it actually can damage the card. It can scratch the back of it, you know, especially if it's moving around. And so I explained to him there was really only one issue of the graded cards, and he's thinking, oh, it's gotta be no problem. I said, unfortunately, the issue is on the most expensive graded card that you have. And I explained to him the debris and the plastic. It would be in everyone's best interest to get the card re-slabbed, not regraded, re-slabbed, reholdered. And hopefully, if all goes well, they would put it back into the PSA 8. And he said, hopefully, if all goes well. What do you mean? He started getting fired up. And I said, I just want to be clear. It's not a guarantee, because if they take that card out and they deem something has happened to it, they may not put it into the 8 holder, because if there's a chance, even if it's minuscule, a 10% chance that that card goes from an 8 to a 6, I mean, it's going to go from $20,000 to $4 grand. You know, I can't have that. At first, he was pretty upset. Then he calmed down, and then he hit me with like a left hook right out of nowhere. He said, all right, the deal's off. I said, okay, just clarify what you mean. Try to stay calm, right? I've been in situations like this before on the road where not everything goes as smooth as you'd like. He said, well, I don't like that, you know, you're not buying the graded cards. Now the sets are off. I explained to him that we already had a deal in principle before I came out here. I also said to you, I had to check everything and verify. That's what I'm doing, that's what I'm performing. And so he got a little bit hot under the collar for a bit. Even said, because I explained to him that there's real expenses that are associated with me coming out here. And he said that he would cover my plane flight. And I said, I very much appreciate that, but how about the $1,200 rental car going back? And he said, $1,200? And I said, well, have you ever priced out a one-way rental from Cleveland, Ohio to New Jersey? But I said, nonetheless, I'm not looking for you to pay for my rental. I'm looking to strike a fair deal. And so I really tried to calm him down. I said, explain to me what's going on in your head. And I understand that he was upset. I said, you also have to understand, though, that I run a business and that I'm now upset and that I've taken my time and I've given it to you and I've done everything that I said I was going to do. I've kept my promise. I didn't ask for this floating debris to be in the plastic. And I said, because he asked me point blank, well, I don't understand. Why can't you do it? And I said, first off, because there's no guarantee. The card will stay in the 8. And he said, well, why don't you just sell it as is and, you know, let the buyer deal with it? And I said, sir, please, it is not a good way to keep an excellent reputation that I worked so hard for, meaning pretending that I don't know that there's potentially a problem with this card or floating debris. I said, I cannot sell in good conscience a card like that. And if it blows up this entire deal, I'd be remiss. I would send you a letter with what you owe me for expenses. And I was very steadfast with him. He might not have paid. Maybe there's lawyers involved. Who knows? But I've been down this road before, and I kept calm with him. And I said, I am on your side. I will help you get the card encapsulated, take care of the issue. There's no guarantee. I think there was a part of him at some point that thought I just didn't want to buy his graded cards. And I said, I'd like to buy everything in your basement. He had Mickey Mantles and Roger Maris's and Jim Brown's and such wonderful autographs and memorabilia. And ultimately, we did reach a deal. And believe it or not, it started off slow. He said, all right, you can buy the sets, but you can't buy any graded cards. And then because I had to go back the next day, he had a good night's sleep. And he said, all right, you can buy the other graded cards, just not the one that's, with the problem. And I said, thank you, I really appreciate it. And it turns out the next day when I went back, we not only bought a bunch of graded cards, but I actually bought several autograph pieces, like some really cool Mickey Mantle pieces with some unique inscriptions, which are not easy to find these days, or quite hot in the autograph marketplace. He had a relationship with Jim Brown and did some private signings with him when Jim Brown would come to town. And so I was able to kind of buy a nice mixture of vintage sets and vintage graded cards and even some memorabilia. And in the end, the deal worked out wonderfully. I've now made a new hobby friend and also someone that might hopefully be able to refer a collection or two in the future. So that is the story of the Strongsville collection that I was able to buy from Don. To make it clear, I did not buy everything from Don. He still has some wonderful memorabilia left. We bought most, if not all, of his cards. I encourage you to not only like this video, but subscribe to our Just Collect YouTube channel so you'll know each and every time a new piece of content will drop as we hit the road in search of vintage treasure. We'll see you real soon.